stone was discovered, Thomas Young, an Englishman whose hobby was studying ancient Egypt, matched a couple names in hieroglyphs on the top third of the Rosetta Stone with the Greek equivalents in the bottom register. In 1822, Jean-François Champollion, a French Egyptologist and the founder of scientific Egyptology, continued Young's work, matching the hieroglyphic symbols of the names with phonetic sounds in a related ancient language that Champollion spoke, called Coptic. Coptic is sort of an in-between language. Halfway between Greek and Egyptian. Soon Champollion figured out the whole alphabet. And the rest is art history. The second largest pyramid is Khufu's at 446 feet. The base covers 11 acres. It is accompanied by the Great Sphinx and a temple complex similar to Khufu's. Menkaur's pyramid, the third of the three Great Pyramids, is much smaller than the other two, standing at about 203 feet. Although pharaohs continued building pyramids until the New Kingdom, the Great Age of pyramid building ended with the Old Kingdom. Middle Kingdom pyramids are much less grand. The pharaoh spent much of his life preparing for death. A new pharaoh built his own tomb, which was considered his second or eternal home, as soon as possible. He stocked the tomb with provisions that he would need in the hereafter, including clothes, toiletries, jewelry, beds, stools, fans, weapons, and even chariots. King Tut was entombed with 4 golden chariots. After his death, the immense task of managing a pharaoh's tomb was given to an entire town. During the Middle and New Kingdoms, rich and middle-class Egyptians also built elaborate tombs. After their death, a family member known as the priest of the double managed the tomb and fed the dead relation from a sort of mummy menu, which included bread, fruit, meat, wine, and beer. For insurance, pictures of food were painted on the walls in case a descendant stopped supplying meals. The pictures, combined with the right spells uttered by the deceased spirit, would magically zap the food onto the table. The tomb housed not only the mummy, but also the deceased's ka, or soul, which was represented by a statue housed in a sealed-off part of the mastaba. The ka statue was a backup in case the mummy disintegrated or was stolen. The statue had to look like the dead person in order for its magic to work. The words carved from life are inscribed on many ka statues. Compare the realistic facial features of the life-sized ka statues of Prince Rahatep and his wife Nofret in Figure 6.3 to the generic faces of King Menkaure and his queen. This realism wasn't intended to impress anybody. When the pharaoh died, the statue was sealed up with him. No one ever saw it again. The Egyptians also preserved and mummified internal organs that the dead would need in the hereafter, like the stomach for digesting delicacies on the mummy menu. The organs were stored in 4 canopic jars, which were usually capped by the animal heads of the 4 sons of Horus. Figure 63, ka statues, like those of Prince Rahatep and his wife, had to be realistic to perform their magic. Werner Foreman Art Resource, New York. The In-Between Period and Middle Kingdom Realism. In 2258 BC, Egypt fractured into constellations of competing states. During this period, Egyptian people modified their view of the afterlife. Now petty princes and the rich who supported them could also have tombs to guarantee them a place among the stars. Instead of building pyramids, wealthy Egyptians carved their tombs in rock cliffs. Soon the pharaohs began to imitate them. Trade expanded during the Middle Kingdom, especially during the 12th dynasty, creating a middle class who demanded rights, including admission to the afterlife. The demand for tomb and coffin paintings rose dramatically. With these liberal trends, the rules for artists were relaxed somewhat. More naturalism was permitted. The bust of Senusret III, a 12th dynasty pharaoh, shows that the new realism applied to all ranks. His slightly downcast, heavy eyes and sensitive mouth show that he feels the burden of his rule. Senusret is represented more as a man than a god. New Kingdom art. The Middle Kingdom ended when the Hyksos, an Asian people, conquered most of Lower Egypt in 1720 BC. The arts declined during this intermediate period, even though the Hyksos tended to respect Egyptian traditions. The decline ended in 1567 when Ahmose I, the founder of the 18th dynasty, reunited Egypt, ushering in the new kingdom. Egypt expanded into Nubia and Libya during this period, becoming an empire. This expansion spread the influence of Egyptian art far beyond its borders and also brought foreign influences into Egypt. Pharaohs stopped building pyramids and began to be buried in the Valley of the Kings in rock-hewn tombs on the west bank of the Nile near Thebes. The trend toward naturalism continued in the New Kingdom, especially during the reigns of Hatshepsut and Akhenaten. The 18th dynasty female pharaoh Hatshepsut ruled from 1473 BC to 1458 BC. She was the queen of her half-brother Thutmose II before becoming regent for her stepson, Thutmose III, and finally pharaoh after her husband's death. During her 21-year reign, Hatshepsut cultivated peace instead of war, commissioned great building projects, and restored monuments destroyed by the Hyksos. She completed the tombs of her father and husband, and built an even more magnificent funerary temple for herself at Deir el-Bahri. Her tomb complex consists of tiered colonnades and two long, sloping causeways, which may have suggested her spiritual ascent after death. At the ends of the second colonnade, she built shrines to Anubis, the god of the underworld, and Hathor. Behind the upper colonnade were temples to Hatshepsut herself and her father, as well as to the chief gods Amun, the king of the gods, and Re, the god of the solar disk. These two eventually merged into one god, Amun-Re or Amun-Re. Hatshepsut was called His Majesty and commissioned male-like images of herself like the Sphinx in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. By most counts, Egypt had only 4 queens in its 3,000-year history, so perhaps Hatshepsut needed such images simply to survive in a man's world. She was buried in the Valley of the Kings. Akhenaten and Egyptian family values. The 18th dynasty pharaoh Amenhotep IV launched a new monotheistic religion in Egypt, built around the sun god Aten. Amenhotep IV shut down the temples of competing gods, especially Amun, whose priests were powerful and tried to prevent the new religion from taking root. The pharaoh changed his name from Amenhotep, which means, Amun is satisfied, to Akhenaten, meaning, it pleases Aten. Then he moved the capital from Thebes, where the cult of Amun was strongest, to a new location that he dubbed Akhetaten. The artists and architects that Akhenaten hired to honor his new religion created a new style of art, which is called the Amarna style by art historians. Akhenaten ordered that open-air temples be built to celebrate the light and love of the sun god in a more natural, open setting. Honesty was of central importance in the new religion, so artists had to depict people, including the pharaoh, more truthfully, in other words, in everyday situations, blemishes and all. The statue of Akhenaten in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, for example, exposes his pot belly. One of the best examples of the Amarna style is the family portrait of Akhenaten, his queen Nefertiti, and their 3 young daughters. The youngest princess, who is still an infant, plays with her mother's earring. Akhenaten tousles the hair of the princess in his arms while she points to the ankh at the tip of a sun ray. The other princess holds Nefertiti's hand and points toward her father, which helps to interlink the family. Intimacy between parents and children was new in Egyptian art. In this case, belief in one god seems to have encouraged more humanity. Figure 64, Akhenaten's family portrait brings the royal family down to earth while linking them to the god Aten. Vanny Art Resource, New York. The sun disk in the relief spreads its rays equally on the king and queen, suggesting that they are co-rulers governing a balanced kingdom under one god. This is a sunken relief. The artist incised the image into the stone rather than cutting out the background, as in raised relief. The painted bust of Akhenaten's queen Nefertiti is the most famous female bust in Egyptian art. Her magnificent jewelry echoes the color pattern of the band in her headdress. The queen is both idealized and realistic. Her rounded shoulders and forward-leaning neck highlight her perfection and humanity. Her name means, the beauty that has come. Raiding King Tut's tomb treasures. Akhenaten's monotheistic experiment didn't take root. It died with him. When the new 9-year-old pharaoh Tutankhaten came to the throne, his vizier, an old-school Amun priest, forced him to change his name to Tutankhamun, which means living image of Amun. The old religion was now back on track. Tutankhamun moved the capital back to Thebes and ordered many of Akhenaten's outdoor temples and other innovations to be destroyed. Tutankhamun's own death mask, made only 9 years later, shows that most of the old formality and rigidity made a comeback after Akhenaten's death. Tutankhamun, by the way, is the only pharaoh with a nickname. He has been popularly known as King Tut ever since Howard Carter discovered his intact tomb in 1922. His was the only king's tomb that hadn't been ransacked by grave robbers. It revealed the full cornucopia of Egyptian wealth and splendor and included a golden throne, 4 golden chariots, precious jewels, a casket of pure gold, statues of gold and ebony, and on and on. You can see why grave robbing was big business in ancient Egypt. Admiring the world's most beautiful dead woman. Tombs weren't simply covered with hieroglyphic spells. They were also elaborately painted, some with depictions of daily life that the dead could observe, but no longer participate in. The most common images were those of gods protecting the deceased. The most elaborate surviving tomb is that of Nefertari, Ramesses II's favorite wife in the Valley of the Queens. In vibrant colors, gods escort the lovely Nefertari on her journey through the afterlife. The tomb also features a creation myth and stories of resurrection. Mummy slaves. Pharaohs were also buried with mummy slaves called ashabtis, which were simply statuettes. Their job was to perform work details such as brewing beer or baking bread so that the pharaoh could lead an afterlife of leisure. The ashabtis even had a script: if the deceased is summoned to do forced labor, I will do it, here am I. Mummy armies also accompanied New Kingdom pharaohs in case they ran into any underworld enemies in the hereafter. Decoding books of the dead. In the Old Kingdom, pyramid texts, which included resurrection spells, charms, passwords, and prayers, were inscribed on pyramid walls. They were used to resurrect pharaohs. During the New Kingdom, similar spells were published in papyrus scrolls called Books of the Dead, which were readily available. Now anyone who could read could be resurrected. But New Kingdom resurrection came with a hitch. The books weren't cheap, and you had to be good to be resurrectable. Although Books of the Dead were individualized for the owner, they all include a goodness test called the weighing of the heart. Figure 65. This narrative scene from the Book of the Dead illustrates the weighing of the heart ritual, the Egyptian version of The Last Judgment. British Library Hip Art Resource, New York. Anubis, the jackal-headed god of the underworld, leads Hunefer's Ka to the judgment scales. In his right hand, Anubis holds an ankh, the symbol of life. Things look hopeful for Hunefer. At the scales, Anubis shows up again, this time to weigh the heart, which is contained in a jar on the left scale. The feather of truth rests lightly on the right-hand scale. The heart had to be very light not to outweigh a feather. The court reporter, ibis-headed Thoth, records the weight while a monster named Amit watches greedily. If the heart is heavy, Amit gets to eat it. But on this occasion, Amit goes hungry. Hunefer moves on to the next stage. The hawk-headed Horus leads Hunefer's Ka to the temple of Osiris to face a second test. To be admitted into paradise, Hunefer must recite secret prayers to Osiris that he memorized while alive, or he could have had the prayers inscribed on his coffin lid if his memory wasn't up to snuff. Inside Osiris's temple, Hunefer encounters the 4 miniature sons of Horus standing on a lotus blossom, a symbol of resurrection. Mot, the goddess of truth, soars overhead, guaranteeing that Hunefer's heart is light. Behind Osiris are his wife, Isis, the goddess of life, and sister-in-law Nephthys, goddess of decay. Too big to forget sculpture. Ramesses II, who ruled Egypt for 67 years and supposedly sired 100 children, had a pharaoh-sized ego. This 19th dynasty pharaoh wanted to be remembered. Maybe he feared he'd get a bad rap from the Bible, if indeed he was the pharaoh of Exodus. In any case, Ramesses erected colossal monuments to himself throughout Egypt, especially at Abu Simbel, Karnak, and Luxor, the temple districts near Thebes. 65-foot statues of Ramesses guard the entrance to his massive temple in Abu Simbel where he could be worshipped as a god. Smaller statues of family members and his chief queen, Nefertari, hover around his knees. Ramesses II also used art as political propaganda. He barely survived the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites, yet he touted it as a great victory on a war monument. Though they are monumental, Ramesses's temples are not always great art. The execution seems coarse when compared to earlier temples. Maybe Ramesses was in a hurry and forced his artists to streamline their work, leaving out details, so they could move on to their next project, another monument to him. Chapter 7. Greek Art, the Olympian Ego and the Inventors of the Modern World. In this chapter, jumping the bulls with the Minoans, understanding Greek sculpture, interpreting Greek vase painting, touring Greek ruins, tracking Hellenism. Everything that grows great also decays. But the memory of our greatness will be bequeathed to posterity forever. The admiration of the present and succeeding ages will be ours, since we have not left our power without witness, but have shown it by mighty proofs. We have forced every sea and land to be the highway of our daring, and everywhere have left imperishable monuments behind us. Pericles. Pericles was right. The world he helped create did decay. But its memory and influence have lasted for nearly 2,500 years, reaching across the ages into our day-to-day lives. Whether you're watching a play or movie, cheering your country at the Olympics, debating an ethical question, visiting the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., wrestling with an abstract math problem, or voting for your local mayor, your actions are rooted in ancient Greece. The Greeks wrote the blueprint for the modern world. They invented democracy, logic, ethics, drama, the Olympics, the study of history, theoretical math, and rational inquiry, laid the foundations of Western art, and developed architectural styles that we still mimic today. We owe our Western heritage to all of ancient Greece, but especially to Athens, which may be the most creative city in history. How did a tiny city-state the size of Toledo, Ohio, launch the modern world 2.5 millennia ago? Read on. The Greeks knew what they were talking about. The Greeks handed down to us a treasure trove of art and literature on government, education, drama, day-to-day life, economics, and even love. Here are just a few of their famous words. Our constitution does not copy the laws of neighboring states, we are rather a pattern to others than imitators ourselves. Its administration favors the many instead of the few, this is why it is called democracy. If we look to the laws, they afford equal justice to all in their private differences, Pericles. Good people do not need laws to tell them to act responsibly, while bad people will find a way around the laws, Plato. We cannot learn without pain, Aristotle. The most important part of education is proper training in the nursery, Plato. Love is a serious mental disease, Plato. There is only one good, knowledge, and one evil, ignorance, Socrates. Mingling with the Minoans, snake goddesses, minotaurs, and bull jumpers. Aegean culture didn't begin with the Greeks, it began with the Minoans in the late 3rd millennium BC. The Minoans lived on the island of Crete, which is about 150 miles long and 36 miles wide. Though they traded with the Egyptians and Mesopotamians, the Minoans lived in relative isolation and developed a unique culture. Their art focused not on death and war like the Egyptians and Mesopotamians, but on life, beauty, and having fun. The Minoans are named after the mythical king Minos, who supposedly ruled Crete and owned a half-man, half-bull pet called the Minotaur. The pet's name is a variant of the king's, because the Minotaur was also his stepson. Minos's wife cheated on him with a bull. Minos penned up his monstrous stepson in a labyrinth and sacrificed young Athenian men and women to him until the mythical Athenian hero Theseus slew the beast. Actually, the Minoans were a peaceful people. They made more tools than weapons, and their chief god was not a thunderbolt-wielding macho man like Zeus, but a sexy-looking snake goddess. Her cult animals included the dove, snake, and bull. The Minotaur myth probably evolved from the Minoans' infamous religious sport, bull jumping, in which young men and women somersaulted off the backs of wild bulls. The Minoans built palaces, which they decorated with elaborate murals. In fact, mural paintings were their greatest cultural achievement. The Toreador. Fresco, which features the bull jumping event, is the most dramatic example. Figure 71. The Minoans didn't run with the bulls like they do in Pamplona, they somersaulted off their backs as shown in the Toreador fresco from Knossos, Crete. Scala Art Resource, New York. Notice that the women vaulters are white-skinned, suggesting that they spent more time indoors than the dark-skinned male jumper. Yet we see total sexual equality here for the first time in art. Man and woman are equal partners in this dangerous but playful religious sport. In fact, the women outnumber the men. The streamlined bodies in the Toreador fresco brim with exuberant life. Even the bull's S-shaped tail looks like a wisp of playful energy. The wave-like shapes of bull and jumper harmonize, suggesting that man and nature are one in Crete. The next in-line jumper stands anxiously on her tiptoes, ready to vault off the bull's back, while an earlier jumper holds the bull's horns. The positions of the three jumpers suggest the sequence of actions involved in bull jumping. Compare the graceful Minoan shapes that seem to flow like waves with the sturdy as a mountain forms of Egyptian art and Mesopotamian art. The latter two were both river-based cultures, hemmed in by deserts. The Minoans were the first civilization to be surrounded by sea. The tides of the Aegean seem to wash refreshingly through the Minoans' art and culture. If art reflects the people who make it, the Minoans must have been a fun-loving folk. Their murals feature diving dolphins, creepy-crawly octopi, lively floral landscapes, and wave-like patterns inspired by the sea. A Minoan palace looked a bit like an indoor SeaWorld. But perhaps their culture was too fun-loving and easygoing to survive in a brutal world. In about 1500 BC, aggressive Greek tribes invaded Crete and established the first Greek culture. Gradually, the Greeks fanned out over the Peloponnesus Peninsula and Aegean islands. But the conquered Minoans didn't disappear completely. They merged with the Greeks, creating what we call Mycenaean culture. The Mycenaeans invented the colorful Greek myths that have been handed down to us and launched the Trojan War, which is recounted in the greatest epic poem ever written, the Iliad. After the Trojan War, Mycenaean culture collapsed, falling to another wave of invading Greek tribes called the Dorians, who settled in Sparta and the Peloponnesus Peninsula. The Ionian Greeks, who'd migrated centuries earlier, remained entrenched in Athens and surrounding Attica, where they had resided since the era of the mythical Theseus and the Minoans. After the fall of Mycenae, several centuries of squabbling passed before Greece settled into what became classical Greece, a constellation of far-flung city-states from Asia Minor and the Greek mainland to Sicily and the Mediterranean coast of France. Although a common language and culture united the Greek states, they were often at war with each other. For about 400 years after the conquest of Mycenae, the Greeks produced no significant art, they were too busy fighting for power and wealth. In the calmer 8th century BC, the earliest manifestations of Greek culture emerged in the visual arts and literature. The Iliad and the Odyssey were written in the 8th and 7th centuries BC, respectively. Greek sculpture, stark symmetry to a delicate balance. The Greeks absorbed the rigidness of the Egyptians, with whom they traded, and the fluid forms of the Minoans. They gradually combined the two into an idealized but naturalistic art that many people consider the greatest art of the ancient world. Kouros to Kritios boy. The evolution of Greek sculpture from the rigid Kouros statues of the 7th and 6th centuries BC to the naturalistic Kritios boy correspond with a seismic political change in Athens that spread to many other city-states. Despotism was replaced by democracy in 508 BC. Kouros statues represented the old order and the aristocracy, rigid, powerful, proud. The more naturalistic Kritios boy represents democracy, relaxed, graceful, and realistic. Kritios boy looked like an idealized version of the man in the streets, as opposed to a stiff superhero like Kouros. The Archaic period. Eventually, the Greeks put their own stamp on all cultural imports. But in the 7th and 6th centuries BC, during the Archaic period, Greek sculptures look like hand-me-down Egyptian tomb statues. The artists obviously spent time in Egypt or studied the imports closely. Compare the archaic Greek statue of a Kouros at the Metropolitan Museum of Art with the Egyptian statues of King Menkora and his queen. Almost everything about the archaic Greek statue says, "I'm Egyptian." The kouros is as symmetrical and rigid as the pharaoh's statue, though the Menkora sculpture is more refined. Both the kouros and King Menkora have squared shoulders, straight, rigid arms and legs, and clenched fists held firmly at their sides. Both step slightly forward with the left foot. Both have pronounced, geometric kneecaps, and the same angular calves, as if they'd been shaped with an old-fashioned wood shaver. But there are differences. The kouros is completely naked. Pharaohs were never represented nude. In fact, only Egyptian children were routinely shown in the buff. The female version of the archaic statue is called a kore, which means maiden. Kors are never nude. Only Greek men were allowed to prance around town in the all-together. Greek women usually stayed indoors to do the sewing and cooking. When they went out to collect water, for example, they wore long gowns. The Greeks gradually shed strict Egyptian symmetry for a more subtle form of balance. The kouros in Figure 7-2, sculpted circa 525 BC, 75 years after the kouros at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, is much more realistic, though he's still stuck in the same Egyptian pose. Notice how much more lifelike the finely modeled curves of the shoulders, arms, and thighs are than in the earlier version. The older statue looks like a stone man. The later one is nearly a flesh-and-blood athlete. He's almost ready to learn to walk. Figure 7. 2. Although still at attention like a frozen soldier, this later kouros, called kroisos, shows the Greek progressio and toward more naturalist IC sculpture. Nimitala Art Resource, New York. But giving statues the semblance of motion took another 100 years. First, sculptors had to learn to depict the body in a relaxed rather than rigid posture. The Classical Period. In the Classical Period, Critios' boy has learned to take it easy. The artist has redistributed his weight. The left hip is now slightly higher than the right, and Critios' boy's bulk rests comfortably on his left foot instead of both feet as in the kouros. The contours of the graceful thighs are utterly lifelike, as is the gentle swelling of the belly. The face, too, is more human than kouros faces. Its still mask-like appearance is due to the holes where inlaid eyes used to be. Figure 73. Greek statues begin to get comfortable around 480 BC. Critios' boy is the turning point. The sculptor has learned to turn the body just enough to give him a more relaxed look. Nimitala Art Resource, New York. Notice the tension in the knees. The left is tight, the right relaxed, showing the distribution of weight. The sculptor has learned to represent a symmetrical young man's body in an asymmetrical stance. The next step was to make the statue walk, run, jump, and throw, or at least appear to. The bronze charioteer from Delphi is stiffer than Critios' boy, but his upright posture would have helped him to be seen standing in a chariot atop a tall monument. The concentrated look in the charioteer's face and the elegant, naturalistic folds of his robe are characteristic of early 5th century Greek realism, also known as the severe style. The statue was commissioned to celebrate an athletic victory, a chariot race. Sports events were a big deal in Greece. During the Olympics, all warfare ceased so the Greeks could compete for laurel leaves instead of fighting for money and power. The fact that the athlete was cast in bronze shows how highly the Greeks regarded sports heroes. They had godlike status, especially in their hometowns, where they were given a pension and free meals for the rest of their lives. Figure 74, the charioteer. Noble expression and proud posture indicate the respect that sports heroes commanded in Greek society. John Garton. Golden Age sculptors. Polykleitos, Myron, and Phidias. The high classical style began in about 450 BC, when Greek sculptors learned to invest statues with the appearance of motion. Myron involved the entire body of Discobolus in a single, compressed action. The statue appears wound up, his energy ready to burst forth. Yet his classically serene face and the faraway look in his eyes contrast with the action of his body, giving the athlete a timeless quality, as if he were throwing his discus into eternity. Polykleitos created a feeling of balance with contrasting tensions that also suggest motion. The off-center pose that gives this relaxed but balanced look is called contrapposto. You can see this effect in a Roman copy of Polycleidos's Dorophoros. The cocked left arm contrasts with the straight or engaged right leg, while the straight right arm offsets the bent left leg. The left leg seems to propel the figure forward. Opposite forces preserve the feeling of balance while imparting a sense of tension and action. The Greek philosopher Heraclitus summed up the concept: opposition brings concord. Polycleidos wrote a book of rules of proportion called the Canon. It was followed by succeeding generations of Greek and Roman sculptors. He cast his original Dorophoros in bronze to illustrate the principles of the Canon. The many surviving marble copies of Dorophoros attest to its popularity and to the respect that Roman copyists had for the Canon of Polycleidos. Figure 75, this Roman copy of Polycleidos's Dorophoros is at ease and tense at the same time. Almost 2,500 years after he was carved, he still has the glow of Greece's golden age. Scala Art Resource, New York. The Greek term canon means rule or standard. Today, when someone speaks of the canon of art history, she's referring to the masterpieces that measure up or meet a set of artistic standards, allowing them to be classed with the greatest works of all ages. In order for Greek culture to survive, the disjointed city-states had to be able to defend themselves against outside aggressors like the Persians. In 480 BC, the Athenians foiled a Persian invasion by outwitting their powerful enemy. Their 380-ship navy outmaneuvered and crushed a much larger Persian fleet of 1,207 ships at Salamis. This gave Athens great prestige in the Greek world and put her at the center of a defensive alliance called the Delian League. All member states contributed money to pay for the navy, which Athens controlled. Eventually, Pericles, Athens's greatest leader, skimmed from the defense funds to give Athens a facelift, making it one of the most glorious cities of the ancient world. This gave the city-state even more prestige, but awakened the jealousy and fear of rivals like Sparta and Corinth, and naturally angered Athens's allies. The rivalry escalated and finally erupted into the Peloponnesian War in 431 BC. The war ended in 404 BC with Athens's definitive defeat. The Golden Age of Greece was over. But the age of Alexander the Great and Hellenism, which would spread Greek culture across most of the civilized world, was about to dawn. If the proverbial glory of Greece rested on two men's shoulders, it would be Pericles and Phidias. Phidias was the most celebrated Greek sculptor and the overseer of the sculptural work for Pericles' building projects on the Athenian Acropolis. One of Phidias's greatest sculptures was the 40-foot-high, gold and ivory statue of Athena, which once stood in the Parthenon. It and most of Phidias's works are lost. His only surviving sculpture are the friezes and pediment statues of the Parthenon, many of which are now in the British Museum. But these and the praise of ancient writers are enough to ensure the sculptor's immortality. The ancients called Phidias's work sublime and timeless. From ancient times through the 18th century, artists often worked in workshops under a master sculptor or painter like Phidias. In such cases, the apprentice artists might do the actual carving of the master artist's design. Often, the master fine-tuned his apprentice's work. The surviving Parthenon statues have these same qualities that ancient writers described. The figures seem to be watching themselves as they participate in the action, as if they were of this world and yet beyond it, part of the Greek heaven, Olympus. Even though the heads of the three goddesses are missing, the superbly rendered fabrics speak for them, revealing the moods, spirit, and down-to-earth sensuality of the flesh and blood women behind the clothes. What are the three goddesses doing? Watching the birth of Athena, the goddess of wisdom, springing full-grown from the brow of her father Zeus. The first-century Greek writer Plutarch, who saw the Parthenon and Phidias's work 5 centuries after they were executed, wrote, "There is a sort of bloom of newness upon those works of his, preserving them from the touch of time, as if they had some perennial spirit and undying vitality mingled in the composition of them." Today, even though they are in ruins, this vitality endures. 4th century sculpture. After the fall of Athens in 404 BC, the city-state gradually got on its feet again, though it never rose to its former glory. Nevertheless, Greek philosophy peaked in the 4th century BC. Plato taught at his famous Athenian academy from about 387 BC to 347 BC, and Aristotle, his greatest student, taught at the Lyceum in Athens from 335 BC to 322 BC, after educating Alexander the Great in Pella, Macedonia. The 4th century also produced 3 great sculptors, Praxiteles, Scopas, and Lysippos. In 4th century sculpture, the wet look got even wetter, but the timelessness associated with Phidias and Polykleitos gave way to an everyday or down-to-earth quality. For example, Praxiteles depicts his Cnidian Aphrodite preparing to take a bath, while his Hermes looks fondly on the playful infant Dionysus cradled in his arm. Figure 76. Praxiteles had a knack for giving statues a soft, sensual look, as you can see in this Hellenistic or Roman copy of his Hermes and the infant Dionysus. Scala Art Resource, New York. 4th century statues also often have a down-to-earth sensuality lacking in 5th century sculpture. Compare Polykleitos' Dorophoros in Figure 7-5 to Praxiteles' Hermes in Figure 7-6. The 4th century also produced the first freestanding female nudes. Praxiteles stripped Aphrodite, the goddess of love, to reveal all her delicate beauty and grace. Naked Aphrodite was a hit, many copies followed. Praxiteles was a master at depicting delicate curves and making marble look like soft, supple flesh. The original Cnidian Aphrodite, like nearly all great Greek statues, has been lost and is only known through Roman imitations and writers' descriptions. Praxiteles' statue of Hermes and the infant Dionysus is nearly as famous as his Aphrodite, and just as beautiful. The softness and classical serenity of the facial features and delicate grace of Hermes' body are hallmarks of Praxiteles' style. The Hermes, once believed to be an original, is now considered to be a superb copy, closer to the spirit of the original than the copy of Cnidian Aphrodite. Figuring out Greek vase painting. Greek vase painting progressed from the somewhat primitive geometric style to the highly realistic early classical style in the early 5th century B.C. Greece also had a brief flirtation with an Oriental style influenced by trade with Mesopotamia. Cool stick figures, the geometric style. At first glance, the paintings on vases from the 10th through 8th centuries BC look like the stick figure doodlings of a child. Closer inspection reveals a complex network of geometric patterns, wraparound chains of Greek frets and chevrons, squares, dots, and squiggly lines, along with stick figures of people and animals. Geometric vases could also tell stories. The Dipylon crater at the Metropolitan Museum of Art shows stick figures pulling their hair out in mourning at the funeral pyre of a Greek warrior. In the next century, the more realistic Oriental style, which made a brief appearance, allowed for clearer visual narrative. The neck of the Oriental-style amphora, the blinding of Polyphemus and Gorgons, depicts a scene from the Odyssey, in which Odysseus and his companions burn out the eye of the one-eyed giant Cyclops. Odysseus pulls off this stunt by first getting the giant drunk. The wine cup in the Cyclops' hand suggests this earlier episode. The Mesopotamian influence is confined to the figures. Odysseus and his men look like Mesopotamians, especially the upper part of the scorpion man in the bottom band of the Ploby lyre. The animals in the middle band and the Gorgons on the belly of the vase also have a Near Eastern flavor. But the Greeks added their own playful charm to the monsters. If you look closely, you can see that the bug-eyed Gorgons show off their sexy left legs like can-can dancers. The belts of interlaced wavy lines at the top, bottom, and neck are leftovers from the geometric period. Black figure and red figure techniques. The Oriental style gave way in the 6th century BC to the even more realistic archaic style. Archaic style painters employed one of two techniques, either the black figure technique, which began in the early 7th century BC, or the red figure technique, which was invented around 530 BC. In black figure painting, the artist first sketched his figures with a lead or charcoal stick on the red clay vase, and then filled in the figures with slip. When fired, the slip turned black, and the unpainted part of the vase remained red. Details were often added with purple or red-dyed slip, as in Hercules slaying the Nemean lion with Iolaus and Athena, an amphora by Cyax. In this vase scene, Hercules, guarded by Athena, overcomes the Nemean lion, one of his famous 12 labors. Gradually, black figure was replaced by a reverse process known as the red figure technique, which allowed the artist to create more detailed renderings of figures. In the red figure technique, the artist sketched the figures, and then incised a 3/16-inch border around them. Next he painted in details with slip. Finally, he painted the background with slip right up to the incised border around the figure. Notice the fine detailed work in the Medea crater. This much detail could not have been achieved in the black figure technique. The Medea crater, which was painted about 30 years after Euripides's famous tragedy Medea premiered in Athens, depicts the play's climax, the witch Medea has just murdered her sons to get revenge on her unfaithful husband Jason. With sword raised, she makes her getaway in a dragon-drawn chariot, alone from her grandfather Helios, the god of the sun. The defeated Jason looks up helplessly at her, his weapon dangling uselessly at his side. The winged women flanking Medea, the daughters of the night, will fight for him. They are furies whose job is to avenge within the family murders. But they'll have a tough time getting past the sunburst of Helios. Rummaging through ruins, Greek architecture. Greek architectural styles are perennially popular. The Romans imitated them for centuries. Europeans imitated them from the Renaissance through the 19th century, and 19th century Americans recycled Greek styles in home building in an architectural movement called Greek Revival. You can find Greek columns, cornices, and pediments in practically every corner of the United States. The Greeks invented 3 orders, or architectural formulas: Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. Each order is based on precise numerical relationships so that all the architectural elements in a structure harmonize. Like musical notes, they must be in the same architectural key or they will seem out of tune. Figure 77, the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian orders were invented by the Greeks. In the Doric order, every pair of columns is topped by 3 triglyphs. A triglyph looks like a set of mini columns. A metope is the space between the triglyphs, on which sculptors sometimes carved reliefs. The entire horizontal section, between the columns and triangular pediment, is called the entablature. Pediment reliefs are notoriously difficult to carve because the artist must fit the visual narrative inside the triangle without making the heights of the figures, which must shrink as you move away from the center, seem unnatural. If you were depicting a battle between Amazons and pygmies, the fit would be easy. You'd stick the Amazons in the center and the pygmies in the corners. Typically, pediment battle scenes feature standing warriors in the center with leaning warriors beside them, then crouching archers, and finally dead men lying in the corners as in the Doric temple of Aphaea in Aegina. In the Doric order, the columns stand on a 3-step base. The columns themselves are fluted like all Greek columns, with 20 grooves each. The columns taper toward the top. The crown of the Doric column, the capital, is made of 2 hats. The bottom one is curved like a bowl, and the top one is rectangular. Doric temples were constructed of stone blocks, which were connected without mortar, so they had to be cut perfectly to give a snug fit and elegant look. The Parthenon was built between 447 BC and 438 BC under Pericles, supervised by Phidias, and designed by 2 architects, Ictinos and Callicrates. At 8 columns wide and 17 columns long, it is bigger than the Doric Temple of Hera in Paestum, built 100 years earlier, yet the Parthenon seems lighter and more graceful. The architects managed this effect by tweaking the proportions. The legs or columns of the Parthenon are thinner than the bulky ones at Paestum. The tapering of the legs toward the top is more subtle. The entablature and platform are not purely rectangular, they curve upward toward the center, giving the structure a feeling of upward lift. All the capitals were adjusted to support this slight curving. The columns also lean imperceptibly toward the center, heightening the upward feeling. Because of this fine-tuning, the weight-bearing columns of the Parthenon don't seem to have to work as hard as those of Paestum. The Paestum temple is oppressive, you can feel its weight bearing down on you. But the Parthenon uplifts you as if it had magically overcome gravity. Figure 78, the Parthenon, a Doric temple, is the architectural high point of Golden Age Athens. Gloria Wilder. The Ionic order is more elaborate than the Doric. The main difference is that the columns are elongated, the capital is capped by a scroll, and the entablature features a continuous frieze or sculpted band. There are no metopes or triglyphs as in the Doric order. The most elaborate order is the Corinthian, which has slender columns capped by overlapping acanthus leaves. Greece without borders, Hellenism. Sent for Aristotle, the most learned and most celebrated philosopher of his time, and rewarded him with a munificence proportionable to and becoming the care he took to instruct his son. Plutarch, Life of Alexander. Alexander the Great was Macedonian, but he learned to think and feel like a Greek from the greatest Greek of the era, Aristotle. After the death of his father in 331 BC, Alexander became king. In the next 8 years, he overran and Hellenized most of the known world, planting Greek libraries and Greek city-states in every vanquished kingdom. But when Alexander conquered, he didn't try to shut down the native culture. Instead, he fused it with Greek models. He himself married, among several other women, a princess from Bactria and ordered his officers to take Persian wives to unify the diverse cultures. After his early death, Alexander's generals divided his empire 3 ways. Seleucus I Nicator ruled Persia, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia. Ptolemy I Soter governed Egypt. Antigonus I Monophthalmus controlled Macedonia and Greece. All these regions eventually fell to the new power rising on the Italian peninsula, the Romans. The last holdout was Egypt, which collapsed in 31 BC when Queen Cleopatra took her own life after Augustus Caesar defeated her and Mark Antony in the Battle of Actium. The Hellenistic period died with Cleopatra. The greatest achievements of Hellenistic culture were in sculpture. Hellenistic sculptors replaced the serene beauty of classical sculpture with powerful emotionalism and sometimes brutal realism. The Nike of Samothrace, a Hellenistic victory statue, looks like she's just landed with her Air Jordans on the prow of a ship, the wind still gusting in her wings and gown. You can feel victory in the folds of her garment and uplifted wings. Also, the sculptor has learned to create art that charges the atmosphere around it. Instead of being self-contained, the statue radiates energy beyond itself into the surrounding space. Hellenistic sculptors also probed the depths of human suffering for the first time in the history of art. The agony of death was never before so vividly portrayed as it is in the Dying Trumpeter, carved in the 3rd century BC in Pergamon, and in Laocoon and his Sons, a Hellenistic sculpture from Rhodes. The Dying Trumpeter is a moving depiction of an enemy Celt warrior wounded in a battle with the Greeks who colonized Asia Minor. The statue is carved in a way that enables the viewer to feel the death pains that the man faces with quiet dignity. Figure 79, Nike of Samothrace, is often attributed to Pythokritos, the great sculptor of the Greek island of Rhodes. John Garton. Figure 710, Laocoon and his sons may have been carved by 3 sculptors from the Greek island of Rhodes, Aegisander, Athenodoros, and Polydoros. All highly skilled copyists. Scala Art Resource, New York. Laocoon and his sons captures the mythical life and death struggle between a father, his boys, and 2 vicious sea serpents. This 1st century BC statue was discovered in 1506 in the ruins of the Emperor Nero's famed Golden House in Rome. Part of the intense expressiveness you see in the Dying Trumpeter and Laocoon and his sons was no doubt due to the assimilation of so many foreign cultures, and part of it to a new worldview. The self-confidence of classical Greece had proved to be self-delusion. Life was gritty and unpredictable, not serene, changeless, and otherworldly. But the serene beauty of Greek classicism didn't fade away completely. The Venus de Milo, shown in figure 711, is a throwback to 4th century Athens. With her unflappable calm, she could have been sculpted by Praxiteles. The fact that her clothes seem to be slipping off enhances the goddess's potent sexuality. Yet her musing gaze takes the viewer beyond her sensuality to a place of mystery. Figure 711, Venus de Milo, is one of the most celebrated Hellenistic sea statues. Eric Lessing Art Resource, New York. Chapter 8. Etruscan and Roman Art, it is all Greek to me. In this chapter, Figuring out why the Etruscans smiled at death, analyzing Roman realism, interpreting propaganda art, touring Roman ruins. The amazing culture of the Greeks had a profound influence on their neighbors. The Etruscans and Romans, in particular, borrowed liberally from Greek culture. However, both peoples took Greek art in new directions that reflect their own unique civilizations. The mysterious Etruscans. The Etruscans appeared in central Italy in the 8th century BC, about the same time that the Greeks founded colonies in southern Italy and Sicily. Because they didn't have their own script, the Etruscans adopted and adapted the Greek alphabet. They also borrowed Greek art styles and techniques and incorporated a handful of Greek gods into their religion. Like the Greeks, the Etruscans were a confederation of city-states. They never united into a nation or empire. Nevertheless, by the 6th century BC, they dominated most of Italy and even ruled Rome from 616 BC to 509 BC. In that year, Brutus and others overthrew Rome's last king, the Etruscan Tarquinius Superbus, and set up a republic. Temple to tomb, Greek influence. Almost nothing remains of Etruscan architecture. But the 1st century BC Roman architect and writer Vitruvius, who saw some of it firsthand, describes Etruscan temples. According to Vitruvius, they were almost square, with an equal amount of space between the porch and the interior of the temple. Built of mud bricks, these Etruscan temples featured simple columns, topped with an entablature and pediment similar to Greek Doric temples. Another difference between Etruscan and Greek temples is that Etruscan temples have a main entrance in the front. And their proportions are squatty, with heavier rooflines than their Greek neighbors. Smiles and stone, the eternally happy Etruscans. Not much is known about the Etruscans because, beginning in the late 5th century BC, the Romans conquered Etruria. City by city, erasing their above-ground culture. By the 1st century BC, all that was left were their tombs. So to decipher Etruscan life, you have to go inside the houses of their dead, which were often built like houses for the living. In fact, some Etruscan cemeteries were designed like underground towns and even had streets connecting the tombs, presumably so the dead could visit each other. The Etruscans were the first ancient civilization to look death in the eye with a smile, at least their tomb statues smile. That's no surprise because early Etruscan tomb decoration didn't feature death's dark side, but echoed life's joys. Birds flit across tomb walls, dolphins swim through painted seas, half-naked dancers gyrate joyously and erotically, banqueters feast, fishermen fish, and hunters pursue their prey. The early Etruscans seemed to view death as part picnic, part safari, and part all-night party. No wonder the statues are smiling, they're surrounded by a panorama of life's pleasures. Most scholars believe that the early Etruscans viewed death as a continuation of life. Another reason Etruscan statues smile is because Greek archaic statues usually smile, and the Etruscans copied them. The archaic smile on Greek statues had a smile for the camera appeal. There never seems to be a reason for the smile, it was just a convention, like saying cheese for a photographer. But in later Etruscan tombs, death is less attractive. The tombs are grim and some of the murals feature demons. Clearly, the Greeks infected the later Etruscans with their dark view of death in Hades, which the Greek poet Homer called the joyless kingdom of the dead. One late Etruscan tomb mural includes an image of the three-headed Greek hellhound Cerberus, who stands sentinel at the gates of Hades, making sure no one ever leaves. Romping through the Roman Republic. Rome began as a city-state ruled by kings in the 7th century BC. After the overthrow of King Tarquinius in 509 BC, the Romans instituted a republic, which was governed by 2 consuls, the Senate, 2 assemblies, and later a group of 10 tribunes. The consuls were elected annually and served 1-year terms. The Roman Senate was made up of wealthy, upper-class Romans who were known as patricians. The 2 assemblies, the Comitia Curiata and the Comitia Centuriata, consisted of plebeians, plebes for short. In practice, patricians controlled both assemblies. In fact, they pretty much ran the show in the early republic. Why? For one reason, Republican Rome didn't pay its elected officials, so only the rich could afford to serve. Of the Republic's 108 consuls, 100 came from the patrician class. This imbalance provoked several civil wars, which were usually followed by bloody reigns of terror called proscriptions. In a proscription, the winners of the civil war murdered their political enemies by the hundreds and even thousands. Many committed suicide to avoid being butchered. After each civil war, power was redistributed a little more fairly, but never enough to satisfy the plebeians. In 494 BC, the government invented another class of government officials called tribunes to appease the plebes. The tribunes were elected to promote plebeian interests and had extraordinary veto powers, but in practice they were often manipulated by wealthy patricians. Later, ambitious men like Julius Caesar used the power struggles to leverage themselves to the top of Roman political life. Such opportunism and the upper classes' refusal to share power with the plebes weakened the government, and after centuries of conquest, perhaps Greater Rome had grown too large for republican rule. Civil wars and bloody proscriptions stained the last century of the Republic. And even before Augustus Caesar founded the empire in 27 BC, Rome flirted twice with one-man rule. In 82 BC, the Roman Senate appointed the celebrity general Lucius Cornelius Sulla as dictator for life. After strengthening the conservative Senate and weakening the power of the tribunes, Sulla resigned in 80 BC. In 48 BC, after Julius Caesar defeated Pompey the Great in a civil war, the Senate elevated Caesar to dictator for life. Caesar was the only winner of a Roman civil war who didn't proscribe or massacre his political enemies after the war. He forgave them and offered many of them, including Brutus and Cassius, posts in his government. 4 years later, in 44 BC, Brutus, Cassius, and other pro-republic conspirators assassinated Caesar on the Ides of March. The two civil wars that followed Caesar's murder ended the Republic forever. The victor, Caesar's heir and grandnephew Octavian, became Rome's first emperor. At its largest, the Roman Empire included most of Western Europe, modern-day Turkey, Syria, Egypt, Macedonia, Greece, the former Yugoslavia, Romania, North Africa, as well as much of modern Great Britain. The Romans planted monuments and built towns, roads, aqueducts, and baths across these diverse lands. They left their mark everywhere, but was it their mark? In most cases, early Roman artists and architects weren't Roman. They were Greek or Hellenized Etruscans. So early Roman art looked like Greek or Etruscan art. Unfortunately, little of it survives. During the late Republic and the Imperial period, Roman master artists were still mostly Greek. No wonder many people have called Rome a copycat culture. Yet Rome was more than that. The Romans added on to their Greek and Etruscan cultural foundation. Perhaps their greatest contribution was an in-your-face realism in portraiture and mural painting and their massive and sometimes majestic architecture, much of it still standing. Roots of realism, a family affair. The Romans practiced ancestor worship, praying to the spirits of their forefathers and foremothers, which were known as manes. Wax versions of ancestors, called lares, stood guard over the family hearth. On feast days, the lares got to wear garlands. On the holiday parentals, family members wore wax or terracotta masks of their dead relatives in memorial processions. Gradually these masks became more and more realistic, paving the way for Roman realism in sculptural portraiture, which sprang up suddenly around 100 BC. Roman realism is called the veristic style. Art as mirror, Roman realism and Republican sculptural portraits. The Romans were practical people, they looked life squarely in the eye. In art, their pragmatism translated into unflinching realism. When viewing their sculptural portraits, you feel as though you're face to face with real Romans. The artists showed their wrinkles, receding hairlines, sagging jowls, and paunches. And they usually captured the disposition of the model. When Julius Caesar's great-nephew Octavian took over the government, not everyone was ready for one-man rule. So Octavian eased them into it. After 2 civil wars in a row, the Senate was docile and content to simply pretend to be a republic. They did what Octavian said, granting him even more power than they'd yielded to Julius Caesar, while preserving the forms of republican government. Augustus refused to call himself king or emperor, it was bad PR. But he did allow the Senate to grant him the title princeps or first citizen, and to give him a new name, Augustus. Roman realism took an idealistic turn when Augustus Caesar launched the Roman Empire in 27 BC. The new emperor had to train the Romans to accept one-man rule, so he spruced up his image and idealized it, making himself appear godlike and super-worthy of his job. Idealism in Roman art is a kind of red flag. It usually means that the art is propaganda. The statue Augustus of Primaporta depicts the youthful Augustus as a general of generals, pointing the way to Rome's imperial future. Specifically, the statue celebrates Augustus's recovery of Roman military standards lost to the Parthians in 53 BC when they defeated the legions of Crassus. The Parthians were Rome's most resilient enemy. The fact that Augustus could beat them elevated his status as commander-in-chief enormously. Figure 81, Augustus of Primaporta is the most copied statue of Augustus Caesar, Rome's first emperor. Eric Lessing Art Resource, New York. The contrast between the statue's metal breastplate and the crumpled toga around his waist has at least two purposes. The softness of the fabric underscores the hardness of the armor and vice versa. Augustus's outfit shows his dual nature. The armor represents his military side as a great general, the toga his administrative side as the first citizen, or princeps, of Rome. Augustus of Primaporta is the embodiment of Roman virtues, youthful vigor, moral rectitude, and unflappable confidence. It also expresses Rome's and Augustus's imperial dignity. Even the boy god Cupid, straddling a dolphin at Augustus's side, looks up in awe at the godlike Augustus. Cupid's presence is also an allusion to the Caesar clan's supposed descent from the goddess Venus. Julius Caesar often claimed descent from Venus. That's how he justified his political dominance of Rome. Augustus's propaganda was a big hit. The statue was so popular that it was copied at least 148 times. Though this form of propagandistic idealism is very Roman, the sculptor modeled Augustus of Primaporta on two famous Greek statues. The pose is almost identical to Polykleidos's Doryphorus. Compare the stances and the position of the feet and left arms. But instead of throwing a spear, Augustus hurls his imperial message. He also looks straight ahead, boldly confronting the world, while Doryphorus turns his head to the right. The pose of the mini-Cupid beside Augustus is modeled on that of the infant Bacchus in Praxiteles' Hermes and Bacchus. In a way, Augustus of Primaporta is a Greek statue inside a Roman one. But most Roman statues and busts, even of emperors, are not idealized. We see only naked realism in the bust of Vespasian, the 9th Roman emperor and builder of the Colosseum. Vespasian was no country club king. He was a tough, blunt, down-to-earth general who fought his way to the top. He never pretended to be a god. In fact, he shocked Rome by dressing himself, putting on his own shoes, and deflating show-offs. According to Suetonius, a Roman historian, when a young man, reeking of perfume, came to thank him for a commission he'd obtained, Vespasian turned his head away in disgust, cancelled the guy's commission, and said he would have preferred that the man stunk of garlic. Vespasian mocked the Roman tradition of deifying dead emperors. On his deathbed, the emperor, who was known for his locker-room sense of humor, cracked his last joke, "Dear me, it seems I am about to become a god." Roman reliefs are more worldly than their Greek counterparts, whose scenes were often set in the clouds of Olympus. Some Roman reliefs were more or less newspaper stories carved in stone. They recounted current events that the emperors didn't want the world to forget. Many of these news reports were carved into Roman triumphal arches, to broadcast the irresistible might of Rome. After winning wars, the Senate usually permitted Roman generals to build triumphal arches and other monuments to commemorate their victories. One of the most famous is Trajan's Column, a 98-foot-high commemoration of the Emperor Trajan's conquest of Dacia. Trajan defeated the Dacians in a two-part war. The first phase was from AD 101 to AD 102, the second from AD 105 to AD 106. Figure 82. Trajan's Column recounts the two-part Dacian war fought at the beginning of the 2nd century AD. Scala Art Resource, New York. The sculptor recounts the marches and battles on a scroll that winds around the column like a film strip. The first campaign is told on the lower half of the column, the second campaign on the upper half. The sculptor scrunches in as many details as he can, often sacrificing aesthetics and creating mixed-up perspectives. You can see a march or battle from above, below, left, or right as if viewing it through multiple camera lenses, which isn't necessarily bad. The column scenes tell a great deal about Roman weapons and war craft. Realism in painting. Roman mural painting, which appeared suddenly in the second half of the 1st century BC, surpassed all earlier painting in depicting life realistically. Because virtually no earlier Roman paintings have survived. Historians don't know how the tradition evolved. It seems to have simply appeared as a fully mature style, which is impossible, because every style starts from somewhere and evolves. Undoubtedly the Romans learned how to paint realistically from Hellenistic models, but almost none of the Hellenistic models have survived either, so historians can't be sure. The Romans, like the Greeks, used intuitive perspective to create the illusion of three-dimensionality on flat surfaces. They didn't have a system for creating perspective, they simply had a feel for it. Roman murals sometimes depict Roman versions of Greek myths, like the fresco of the marriage of Venus and Mars found in the House of Fronto in Pompeii. Compare the use of perspective in this fresco to flat Greek vase painting. The Romans took realism to a much higher level. Notice the three-dimensionality of the furniture and the shading in Venus's face. Also notice that the head of the woman standing in the doorway is slightly smaller than the other heads. Figure 83, the marriage of Venus and Mars illustrate Roman artists. Use of intuitive perspective E. Alinari Art Resource, New York. The Flora fresco from ancient Stabii, 41 2 miles south of Pompeii, is perhaps the most poetic of all Roman paintings. Because Flora, the goddess of flowers, gently turns her face from the viewer, you can only imagine her beauty or feel it reflected in the landscape that she beautifies. Flora is credited with bringing color into the world by planting flowers everywhere. The Roman poet Ovid says Flora warns us to use life's beauty as it blooms, to pluck it, just as she picks fresh flowers in the fresco and collects them in her basket. Little happens in this poetic painting, little needs to happen. The soft, caressing beauty of the landscape, the hinted at loveliness of the barefoot goddess in her windswept gown, and her delicate gesture are enough. The fresco is as beautiful and moving today as it ever was, even in its damaged condition. For all its might and imperial majesty, Rome definitely had a soft side. Roman mosaics. When Roman artists wanted an image to last, they used mosaics. Roman mosaics are made with small colored stones, pebbles, or pieces of glass cemented together to form highly realistic pictures like the scene from New Comedy from Pompeii. Notice the comic facial expressions and the realistically ruffled fabrics of the actors in the mosaic. The figures even cast shadows. All this was achieved with tiny pieces of colored stone. The small town of Vienne, France, which the Roman historian Tacitus described as an historic and imposing city, has more than 250 superbly preserved floor and wall mosaics. The Hylas mosaic from Vienne shows the mythical hero Hylas being seduced by two nymphs while he tries to fill his water pitcher at a spring. The decorative border frames the central scene with simple but stylishly effective shell and floral patterns. Figure 84, the Hylas mosaic illustrates the brief but often represent the myth of Hylas and the nymphs. Hylas, who was Hercules' lover, disappeared after trekking to a spring to fetch water. Gloria Wilder. After the fall of the Western Empire in AD 476, the mosaic tradition continued to flourish in the Eastern Empire and in the Italian city-state of Ravenna. Roman architecture, a marriage of Greek and Etruscan styles. Architecture, like the Ionic Temple of Apollo in Pompeii, built in about 120 BC, is the best preserved art form of the Republican period. This temple is so Greek in style that it looks like it was shipped from Greece piece by piece. Temple of Portunus. Later temples, like the Temple of Portunus, built in the 1st century BC, look a little more homegrown. Although At first glance the structure appears to be a miniature Greek temple with graceful Ionic columns and an unadorned entablature and pediments. There are some subtle differences. Instead of the all-around three-step platform used in Greek temples as a base for the columns and a staircase, the Romans added a flight of steps in front of the temple. In other words, they built a main entrance. Also, while Greek temples are oriented toward the rising and setting sun for religious reasons, Roman temples can face any direction. Their position was determined by practical rather than religious reasons, the proximity of other buildings and Roman laws, which ensured that each building and house had its daily quota of sun rays. Solar heating was mandated by law in ancient Rome. No one was allowed to erect a new building that blocked an older building's access to the sun. The Roman architect Vitruvius made sun-facing windows part of his housing designs. Maison Carrée. About a century after the Temple of Portunus was built, a similar but larger temple called the Maison Carrée was erected in Nîmes, a wealthy Roman city in Gaul. Whereas the older Temple of Portunus uses the simpler Ionic columns, the larger and more elaborate Maison Carrée employs Corinthian columns. The Maison Carrée is the best preserved Roman temple in the world. Roman aqueducts. A few miles from Nîmes stands one of the most famous Roman structures, the Pont du Gard, a sprawling 900-foot-long aqueduct. Pont du Gard was once part of a 31-mile aqueduct that carried 44 million gallons of water a day from the Eure River in Uzes to Nîmes. The Pont du Gard was built in the middle of the 1st century AD, probably by Augustus Caesar's son-in-law Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. Figure 85, the Maison Carrée, in Nîmes, France, which was erected around 19 BC to 16 BC and dedicated to heirs of Augustus. Inspired the Virginia state capitol designed by Thomas Jefferson and completed in 1788. Gloria Wilder. Roman engineering skills were unsurpassed in the ancient world. Although some of the aqueduct's limestone blocks weigh up to 6 tons, no mortar was used to hold them together. Yet the structure has held together for 2,000 years. How? Roman engineers linked the stones with sturdy iron clamps that are still holding today. Is the Roman arch Roman? Whereas most Roman temples look Greek or Greek-like, many other Roman structures actually look Roman. Majestic triumphal arches, massive, sprawling aqueducts, and the Colosseum have a distinctly Roman appearance. All these structures have rounded arches. In fact, the arch is their main architectural feature. Roman triumphal arches appear throughout the former empire. The Triumphal Arch of Orange was built by Julius Caesar in 49 BC in Orange, France, to commemorate his first victories over the Celts of Gaul. A Roman arch is part gateway, a road usually passes through an arch, and part memorial. The first arches were built of brick and stone. Later architects employed marble to make the memorials endure. Some triumphal arches have ornamental columns and most are decorated with commemorative reliefs that recount military victories. Gloria Wilder. The Colosseum. Rome's showcase building is the Colosseum, a 6-acre sports arena where gladiators fought each other to the death. The Colosseum also featured fierce wild animal hunts, mock naval battles, and public executions in which starved, man-eating animals mauled criminals tied to stakes. The arena also had warm-up circus acts like wrestling alligators, tightrope walking elephants, and human acrobats. On several occasions, Roman emperors fought in the arena. The Emperor Vespasian began building the Colosseum in AD 72. His son Titus completed the amphitheater in AD 80 and inaugurated it with 100 days of games 1 year later. The Colosseum design was based on linking 2 theaters together, which is why the structure is called an amphitheater. 76 entrance gates and barrel-vaulted corridors efficiently lead to 3 levels of tiered stone seats, allowing crowds of more than 50,000 people to enter and exit easily. The Colosseum also had a system of canvas awnings that was so complex that an entire naval unit was needed to operate it. The Romans didn't try to disguise the structural features of the Colosseum. Instead, they gave them a pleasing appearance. The 3-level, circular arcade of arches looks like windows inviting passers-by into the arena. The faux columns between the arches are basic Doric on the 1st level, Ionic on the 2nd, and Corinthian on the 3rd. As your eye travels up the building, the orders of architecture become more elegant and refined. The Pantheon. The Pantheon, the temple of all the Roman gods, is Rome's most perfect building. It is topped by a gloriously constructed dome with a 143-foot diameter. The distance from the dome's peak to the floor is also 143 feet. When you enter the Pantheon, you have the sense of being inside a globe under the dome of an Olympian sky. The 29-foot-wide oculus at the top enhances this feeling, allowing natural light to stream into the temple during the day and the stars and moon to peer through in the night. Figure 86, the Pantheon, built between AD 125 and AD 128, is Rome's supreme architectural structure, a wonder of the Roman world. Alinari Art Resource, New York. In the Pantheon, aesthetic considerations have priority over practical ones. A mask of marble hides the massive supporting brick arches and concrete walls. A spacious, circular colonnade of graceful Corinthian columns appears to support the dome effortlessly. Everything in the temple rises toward the oculus, making visitors feel as though they're transcending gravity and floating into the company of the gods. Rome's fall. Why did Rome fall? Maybe the empire got too big for its britches and had too much frontier to defend. In the late 3rd century AD, the Emperor Diocletian decided that the empire was too vast for one man to rule, so he split it into two halves, each with its own emperor and sub-emperor. This form of government is called a tetrarchy. Maybe Christianity, which became the state religion in AD 380. During the reign of Theodosius I, gradually changed the fabric of Roman society and the empire model no longer fit. Some have accused 4th and 5th century Romans of getting lazy and soft. They hired mercenaries, Vandals, Huns, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, and Burgundians, to fight for them and allowed these tribes to settle in Roman provinces as federates. By the middle of the 5th century AD, the Visigoths and Burgundians occupied most of southern Gaul. Many of the federates frequently turned on Rome. In AD 476, a coalition of Germanic tribes overran the city of Rome and ejected Romulus Augustus, the last Roman emperor, replacing him with their leader, Odoacer. With the fall of Rome, culture declined, too. Government commissions to construct new buildings and design reliefs, statues, and mosaics dropped off. Art and culture retreated to Christian monasteries. Many of the techniques of making art were forgotten or lost. Besides, a Christianized Europe rejected or transformed the pagan, worldly art of the Roman Empire. They preferred art that turned man's gaze to heaven or art that terrified him into behaving. But only half of the Roman Empire fell in AD 476. The Eastern or Byzantine Empire, the capital of which was Constantinople, endured for another 1,000 years, though often on shaky legs. The Byzantine Empire preserved Roman art traditions, in a modified form. Oriental influences from Byzantium's neighbors mingled with traditional Roman art styles to create a uniquely Byzantine style. Part 3. Art after the fall of Rome AD 500, AD 1760. In this part, you see how the crash of Rome and the rise of Christianity and Islam changed everything in Europe, North Africa, and the Near and Middle East. I examine the new art forms that Eastern and Western Christian artists and Islamic artists invented to express the new religions, and how these art forms evolved or stayed the same over the next dozen centuries. You also see that, although when Rome fell its art styles stumbled, they eventually got back on their feet and are still with us today. Chapter 9. The Graven Image, Early Christian, Byzantine, and Islamic Art. In this chapter, understanding the development of early Christian art, exploring Byzantine architecture, reading mosaics. Understanding icons and the iconoclasm controversy, touring Islamic architecture. In this chapter, I cover the art and architecture of 3 cultures and 2 great religions. Each culture developed a unique form of art and architecture to promote its faith, and each responded strongly and somewhat differently to the second commandment. The rise of Constantinople. In AD 324, Constantine the Great decided to pack up and move the capital of the Roman Empire to Byzantium, which was soon renamed in his honor, Constantinople. Transplanting Rome's capital was a stroke of genius. Byzantium was the center of the known world, the fulcrum on which Constantine would balance the needs of East and West. The city sentinels the Bosporus Strait where the busy waters of the Black Sea and Sea of Marmara intermingle. Europe and Asia eyeball each other across the strait, which at its narrowest is less than a half-mile wide. In those days, the world's wealth flowed through the Bosporus and into the pockets of Constantinople's entrepreneurs. From his new capital, the emperor could control all imperial trade and marshal his forces to defend both halves of the Roman Empire much more efficiently than he could from Rome. Christianizing Rome. Constantine, the first Christian emperor, elevated Christianity to one of the official religions of Rome in 313, ending his predecessor Diocletian's persecution of the sect. Although Christianity didn't become Rome's state religion until the reign of Theodosius in AD 380, Constantine virtually united church and state, possibly to solidify his own power. After all, Christianity was on the rise. Now he was the official head of state and the unofficial head of the Christian Church. It was Constantine who called the First Council of Nicaea in 325 to determine the exact relationship between Jesus Christ and God. It was Constantine who swayed the council's 318 bishops, who were strongly divided on the issue of whether Jesus was less than or equal to God, to almost unanimously accept his view, that Father and Son are one. The two dissenting bishops were excommunicated and exiled. After the fall, divisions and schisms. The new life Constantine breathed into the Roman Empire helped it survive through the 4th and most of the 5th centuries. When Rome finally fell in AD 476, its artistic traditions splintered. In the Eastern Empire, classical Roman art blended with Oriental styles into Byzantine art, which had both an imperial and an Orthodox Christian focus. In the West, classical styles helped launch a new style, early Christian art. But once Western Christian art got off the ground, classical styles went into hibernation for centuries. Besides a political and cultural breach between East and West, there was also a religious breakup. The Eastern and Western Christian churches gradually drifted apart after the fall of Rome. Differing religious customs and beliefs, a communication gap, and a centuries-old power struggle between the popes and patriarchs caused the final rupture, known as the Great Schism in 1054. The Crusades, in part, were the papacy's attempt to reunite the Eastern and Western churches. In the 13th and 15th centuries, popes and patriarchs came close to healing the rift, but they were ultimately unsuccessful. The schism continues to this day. After Rome's fall, the Eastern Empire stayed on its feet for another 1,100 years, except when it nosedived briefly in the 13th century. But the empire bounced back 57 years later, surviving on somewhat shaky legs for almost 2 more centuries until the Ottoman Turks finally overran it in 1453. Early Christian art in the West. Before Constantine and even after, paganism and Christianity competed for the hearts and minds of people living in the empire. The Persian religion Mithraism was Christianity's chief rival. Mithraism was so widespread that apparently the Emperor Diocletian proclaimed the god Mithra the protector of the empire in the early 4th century while his anti-Christian persecution was in full swing. Religious rivalry drove many Christians to reject anything that reeked of paganism, including art styles. For example, early Christian artists never sculpted life-size, freestanding nudes like Polykleidos's Dorophorus or Spear-bearer and Praxiteles' Hermes and Dionysus, not only because the statues are naked, but also because they were too realistic. It was thought that they could be confused with what they represent. Living in the wake of idol worship, early Christians didn't want to replace the old idols with new ones. Christianity suppressed virtually all life-size, freestanding sculpture for 1,000 years. But Christians still needed sacred images to remind them of their faith. So early Christian artists struggled to create an acceptable visual language to broadcast their religious ideals. At first they borrowed from classical painting and relief, adapting the visual vocabulary of pagan art to express Christian beliefs. Almost nothing survives from the first 3 centuries, when Christianity was still an underground religion. The earliest Christian artworks are 4th-century catacomb paintings like the ceiling mural in the catacomb of Sts Pietro and Marcellino in Rome, the images are Christian, but the look is Roman. Due to centuries of deterioration, the mural is hard to make out. Thanks to extensive restoration, the early 5th century mosaic, Christ enthroned and the apostles in the heavenly Jerusalem in the 4th century church Santa Pudenziana in Rome, is in excellent condition and illustrates the Roman influence even better. The use of perspective and shading, and the naturalistic gestures and folds in the garments are typically classical. The Roman illusionism is especially striking given that the mosaic was executed on the curved wall of an apse. The Roman influence isn't only apparent in the artist's technique. The New Jerusalem behind Christ is a Roman-style city. Notice the Roman arches of some of the buildings. Also, Christ sits in a throne like a Roman emperor, and the apostles flanking him are arrayed in togas like Roman senators. Notice that each apostle has individualistic features. These are not mere symbols, they are realistic depictions of men. Peter, who sits on Jesus' right, is being crowned by a woman who represents the Jewish people he converted. Paul, on the left, is crowned by a woman who symbolizes the Gentiles that he converted. The point, the New Jerusalem includes both Jews and Gentiles. Figure 91, Christ enthroned and the apostles in the heavenly Jerusalem shows that Roman illusionism was still alive and well in early Christian art. Scala Art Resource, New York. This mosaic is one of the earliest images in which Christ appears with the cross. But instead of being crucified on it, here the bejeweled cross is depicted above Jesus' head to symbolize his heavenly glory. Also, it may be the first time that the traditional emblems of the evangelists are shown in art: St. Matthew, a winged human being; St. Mark, a lion; St. Luke, an ox; St. John, an eagle. The winged creatures have a dual role here. They were first described in the 6th century BC by the Old Testament prophet Ezekiel. As for the likeness of their faces, they four had the face of a man, and the face of a lion, on the right side, and they four had the face of an ox on the left side. They four also had the face of an eagle. Here Ezekiel reveals his vision of the approach of God's winged attendants before describing the New Jerusalem later in the book. The positions of the winged creatures shows that the artist intended to illustrate Ezekiel's vision of the New Jerusalem. Byzantine art meets imperial splendor. When most people think Byzantine, they think of painted icons, glimmering mosaics, and multi-domed cathedrals. The style started in the 5th century AD in Constantinople and has never gone out of fashion. Modern icons and icon screens still beautify Orthodox churches around the world. Originally, Byzantine art celebrated both church and state. Today, it is strictly religious art for Eastern Orthodox churches, many of which now also exist in the West. The Eastern influence of Byzantine art derived from Greece and, to a lesser extent, Egypt and Syria, which remained part of Greater Byzantium until the Arab Empire absorbed them in the 7th century. In the 11 centuries of its existence, Byzantium spread its glittering art traditions through North Africa, the Balkans, Russia, Italy, Sicily, Egypt, and Syria. Byzantine culture also influenced medieval and Renaissance art through trade and contact with the crusading forces of the 11th through 13th centuries. In the West, the greatest Byzantine works are in Venice and Ravenna, Italy, as well as in Sicily. Byzantine art is usually divided into three periods: Early Byzantine, Middle Byzantine, and Late Byzantine. The iconoclasm controversy, which separates the early and middle periods, shut down most art production for over 100 years, after Emperor Leo III declared war on religious art in AD 726. Iconoclasm means image breaking. Justinian and early Byzantine architecture. Justinian ascended to the Byzantine throne in 527, 51 years after the fall of Rome. He thought his first job was to restore the entire Roman Empire, and he came pretty close. Justinian recaptured North Africa from the Vandals, Italy from the Ostrogoths, and southeastern Spain from the Visigoths, as well as Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. But he never made it to France or Britain. At the same time, his armies held the Persian Empire at bay in the east. But his conquests were short-lived. What endures from Justinian's reign are his civil code of laws and the art and architecture that Justinian and his queen, Theodora, commissioned. Corpus Juris Civilis is a collection of all Roman law from the time of Emperor Hadrian through the reign of Justinian. Justinian's law code became the basis for Western European law during the Middle Ages. It also influenced Eastern European and Russian law codes. The greatest architectural triumph of Justinian's reign is Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. Fire destroyed two earlier versions of Hagia Sophia. Justinian began rebuilding the church immediately after the last of the two fires, in 532, and finished it 5 years later. The new Hagia Sophia was a sensation, the greatest church to date. It is sometimes called the eighth wonder of the world. Justinian chose Isidore of Miletus and Anthemius of Tralles to design Hagia Sophia. The result seemed like architectural magic to contemporaries. The interior evokes a feeling of transcendence. The windows, walls, and arches lift your eyes and spirit toward the central dome, which appears to hover on a crown of light, a ring of 40 tightly spaced, arched windows. The ceiling of Hagia Sophia looks like nothing less than the vault of heaven. 2 tiers of arched windows below the crown contribute to the feeling that you're being uplifted as you enter this church, ascending on a ladder of light toward God. Figure 92, the interior of Hagia Sophia is celebrated for its mystical lighting. Eric Lessing Art Resource, New York. The dome soars 184 feet from the floor and has a 335-foot base. To set the dome on what looks like a flimsy collar of window supports, the architects had to reduce its weight. They achieved this by constructing the dome from a thin shell of brickwork. In addition, 2 half-domes on either side of the main dome and external buttresses counter the dome's thrust, that is, they do most of the work holding it up. Yet these supports are so integrated into the overall structure that they don't seem to be supporting anything. They look ornamental rather than functional. The entire structure appears to transcend gravity, making it feel like a truly otherworldly place. The architect's greatest challenge was to solve a geometry problem. How to set a round dome on a square base. The solution: pendentives, rounded triangular groins or legs fanning out from the 4 piers. Pendentives are curved legs made by cutting 4 semicircular scallops from a dome. I'll call this dome A. The architect sets the 4 pendentives of dome A securely on the 4 supporting columns of the square base. Then he slices off the top of dome A and sets the circular base of a smaller dome B snugly on top of it. In other words, the architect secures a round dome on a square base by inserting an intermediate dome that's round on top and square on the bottom between them. Amazing mosaics, puzzle art. Byzantine artists tried to depict heaven in their art. To achieve their goals, Byzantine artists needed a new medium that would suggest divine and imperial splendor. They chose wall mosaic, which was later dubbed painting for eternity, probably by the Renaissance artist Domenico Ghirlandaio. Mosaic painting was not new. Centuries earlier, the Romans created elaborate mosaic floors that often looked like paintings. Because people walked on these paintings, they needed to be made from durable material. Roman artists chose natural colored marble that allowed them to paint fine gradations of color with which they achieved illusionistic effects like perspective and shading, as in the scene from New Comedy Pompeii mural. Roman mosaic floors are gorgeous, but the colors are dull compared to Byzantine mosaics, which shimmer like holiday tinsel. To produce this glittering effect, Byzantine artists used colored glass instead of marble. The palette of colors included emerald greens, Mediterranean blues, royal purples and reds, glittering golds, and clear glass laid on a gold or silver backing called foil. Also, the glass was cut at various angles, which makes light reflect off the surface in multiple directions. Byzantine mosaics seem to radiate light rather than reflect it. The downside of using colored glass is that it doesn't offer the variety that natural marbles do. You can't create the subtle color gradations needed for shading and illusionistic effects. But Byzantine artists weren't after realism. They wanted their mosaics to suggest visions of heaven. Few early mosaics survive in Constantinople from Justinian's period. The most sublime early mosaics are in Ravenna, Italy, and Salonika, Greece. In this section, I focus on the ones in Ravenna. San Vitale, Justinian and Theodora mosaics. The greatest wall mosaics in Ravenna are at the Church of San Vitale and the Basilica of Sant'Apollinare Nuovo in Classe, the port of Ravenna on the Adriatic coast. In this section, I examine the San Vitale mosaics. In 527, Ecclesius, the bishop of Ravenna, began building San Vitale. It took 20 years to complete, and Ecclesius didn't live to see the final product. Bishop Maximianus completed the job in 548. Both bishops are depicted in wall mosaics in the church. Entering San Vitale is like walking into a jewelry box. Gorgeous mosaics of saints, angels, Christ and his apostles, and Old Testament figures surround you as if you've stumbled into heaven. Glittering gardens, populated by exotic birds, wildflowers, fruit, and stars, are interwoven with the holy figures. Jesus appears at the summit of the chancel vault, wearing imperial purple and sitting on a blue globe. He passes a crown to the man on his right, the martyr San Vitale. On the other side of him, Bishop Ecclesius offers Jesus a replica of the church, indicating that the Church of San Vitale is dedicated to both Christ and Saint Vitale. At first glance, the design seems simple. The cross-section looks like a short-stemmed flower planted in an octagonal flower bed. Each flower petal, budding from the circular nave in the center, corresponds to one side of the octagon. The ambulatory separates the octagon from the ring of flower petals. The stem of the flower extends just outside the octagonal frame into the apse. Inside the church, you encounter a mesmerizing interplay of spaces that reveal the genius of the architect. Giant two-story archways with half-dome caps meet at sometimes surprising angles, making the space seem bigger than it is. Side chapels flanking the apse are a typical feature of Byzantine churches. Colored glass cubes cover every inch of the walls and vaults of the chancel. Medallions of Christ and his apostles emblazon the triumphal arch that leads into it, while the sacrificial Lamb of God stands at the center of the vault directly above the altar, signifying both Christ's sacrifice and Holy Communion. Although Justinian and Theodora may never have visited Ravenna, they are depicted on the apse wall mosaics as if they had attended the church's consecration in 547. The north and south walls show Justinian and his retinue and Theodora and her attendants participating with Bishop Maximianus in the church's consecration. Each group stands in a row facing you like actors on a stage. The Theodora mosaic, the south wall of the apse. Despite their flatness, the faces express individuality, especially Theodora's and the two women on her left, who may be her closest friend Antonina, the wife of Justinian's top general Belisarius, and her lovely daughter Joan Nina. Figure 93, the San Vitale mosaic of Empress Theodora and her attendants, offers a glimpse into the royal fashion of the period. Camera Photo Arte, Venice Art Resource, New York. Theodora is displayed in San Vitale as Justinian's equal. And she was. Procopius, the imperial biographer, said, "They did nothing whatever separately in the course of their life together." In one of his laws, Justinian called her "our most reverend partner granted us by God." She helped write some, if not most, of the laws. Theodora influenced policy more than any other empress while the emperor was still alive. She encouraged him to write laws to benefit the underprivileged and women, especially prostitutes. Together she and Justinian built a refuge for the most downtrodden prostitutes. The refuge was actually a convent where the ex-prostitutes were required to live like nuns. The Justinian mosaic, the north wall of the apse. The Justinian mosaic, on the opposite side of the apse from the Theodora mosaic, is less colorful, though still highly impressive. He holds a gold paten, while Theodora on the opposite wall bears the chalice for the communion wine. This suggests that they were co-rulers even in spiritual matters. The emperor is flanked by the two aspects of his power, the secular and the spiritual. Bishop Maximianus, who completed and consecrated the church, stands on Justinian's left. Maximianus's name appears above him, not only to identify him, but also to serve as his signature on the work. Notice that both Justinian and Theodora have halos, putting them on the level of the saints, martyrs, and apostles. The mosaics of St. Mark's Basilica, Venice, Italy. Constantinople also left its imprint on Venice, which it dominated in the 8th and 9th centuries. The domed Basilica di San Marco is Byzantine to the bone. The first St. Mark's was built in 829 to preserve the hijacked bones of St. Mark the Apostle. The building of the current structure began in the middle of the 11th century. After the collapse of Rome, the early Venetians picked St. Theodore as their patron, a minor saint for a minor city. But by the 9th century, Venice was on the rise and was determined to bolster its prestige by adopting a famous patron saint. So in 828 Venice sent 2 sailors to Alexandria to hoist the bones of St. Mark the Evangelist, the guy who wrote the Gospel of St. Mark. This gave Venice the spiritual leverage it needed to become a great city-state. The Venetians began building a grand church to house the body of St. Mark. Indiana 829. St. Mark's symbol, the winged lion, became the symbol of Venice. The original wooden-framed St. Mark's burned down during a revolt in 976. Work began on the present basilica in about 1063. The 5-dome structure is partly modeled on Hagia Sophia and the Church of the Apostles in Constantinople, originally built by Constantine in the 4th century and then rebuilt in the 6th century, possibly by Theodora. St. Mark's is based on the Greek cross. 3 of the 5 domes rest on one arm of the cross, and the remaining 2 domes rise above the other arm. Barrel vaults connect the series of domes. Mosaics on a splendorous field of gold encrust the entire surface of vaults, domes, and cupolas. Entering the church, you're greeted by the creation mosaics, 26 episodes from Genesis, including God separating light from darkness, God creating the plants, and then the animals Adam and Eve meeting and falling for each other, God banning the sinful couple from the Garden of Eden. The mosaics highlight many of the most famous Bible stories. After the creation series in the atrium, you enter the church itself where the entire New Testament spreads before you in an opulent visual display. It took over 700 years to complete these mosaics, which cover more than 26,000 square feet. The basilica served as the personal chapel of the Doge until 1807, when it became everybody's chapel. Icons and iconoclasm. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Exodus 20 verse 4. In 726, Emperor Leo III, who took the second commandment literally, issued a proclamation, destroy all religious images. Only abstract design was permitted. Iconoclasts marched into churches destroying icons and mosaics of Christ, Mary, and the saints. Most monasteries, however, didn't support the edict. Icons attracted pilgrims and donations, so they hid as many icons as they could. Icon lovers were dubbed iconodules. Leo ordered that anyone caught hiding an icon be flogged and, in extreme cases, when caught hiding lots of icons, blinded or mutilated. When Leo's offspring became emperors, they continued his policy. 117 years later, the last iconoclast emperor Theophilus died, and his wife, the Empress Theodora, an iconodule, ended iconoclasm once and for all. Iconoclasm didn't take root in Italy. The popes opposed it, which may be why the great mosaics of San Vitale survive today, while very little 5th, 6th, and 7th century art exists in Constantinople. An icon is meant to be a window to heaven, not a window to the world. For this reason an icon represents Jesus's or Mary's heavenly features, not their earthly looks. Because of this, icons don't have shading or highlights. The light on an icon's face arises from within, like his spirituality. This is one reason why mosaics were a mainstay of Byzantine art. They look like they radiate light, and they don't allow for much earthly realism. When you look at icons, you may notice that they are very similar. Orthodox Christians believe that Saint Luke the Evangelist painted the first images of Jesus and Mary, and he knew what they looked like. So later artists simply made copies of those pictures, preserving the true features. Also, Byzantine artists used symbolism instead of facial expression to communicate spirituality. They thought that facial expressions were too worldly and that spiritual beings have more subtle ways to speak to us. Gestures, objects in the hands, even the colors of a saint's clothes all have symbolic meaning. For symbols to communicate ideas, everyone must agree on their meaning. Therefore, the symbols must never change. Icon painters follow strict formulas that govern everything from the shapes of noses to the colors of clothing. The mouths, noses, and eyes of icons no longer have worldly functions. They have spiritual functions instead, and their stylized shapes reflect these new functions. The mouths are usually closed, small, and pinched because heavenly beings don't eat much, and they don't chatter. Jesus and Mary usually wear red and blue. Red represents divinity and blue symbolizes humanity, so Jesus typically wears red against his flesh and blue as an outer garment, which indicates that his divine inner nature is encased in a human form. Mary's colors are reversed because she is a human being who becomes divine. However, some artists don't follow this color coding. Westerners look for originality in an artwork, Byzantines look for consistency. For this reason, an icon painting in the 12th century, the 15th century, and the 21st century all look pretty much alike. Byzantines also believed that three-dimensional figures were too much like sensual pagan art, which glorified the flesh. So they created a flat style, embroidered with symbolism. The 12th century Virgin of Vladimir was probably painted in Constantinople. The cheek-to-cheek pose of Mary and Child and the harmonious relationship of their bodies is typical, one of several formulaic poses of Mary and baby Jesus intended to show Mary's compassion. This icon type is known as Umilini. The Virgin of Vladimir was eventually exported to Russia, which converted to Orthodox Christianity in the 9th and 10th centuries. Christianity became the official Russian religion in 988. Russian artists learned icon painting by copying icons from Constantinople like the Virgin of Vladimir. Afterward, icon painting was practically the only art form in Russia until the end of the 17th century. The greatest Russian icon painter is Andrei Rublev, who was a monk as well as an artist. Rublev followed the formulas of icon painting but still managed to be original. He gave his icons a unique and extraordinary sensitivity. In his masterpiece The Old Testament Trinity, which was painted for a monastery near Moscow, the angels still have generic icon looks, long, lean noses, tiny mouths that look like they could barely swallow a peanut, almond-shaped eyes, identical hairdos that modestly frame their faces, and garments that hang in exactly the same way. Yet each angel quietly exudes his own personality. Rublev's paintings convey tenderness and a gentle poetry that other icons lack. Each angel's body bends a little differently, their postures express unique spiritual and poetic emotions. The combination of the harmonious gestures and forms and the luminescent colors give the painting a rhythmic, lyrical quality. The Dormition Shroud is a modern Orthodox icon painted by Christine Uviges and the Icona Workshop in 2004. The expressions, pose, gestures, and the flatness of the composition show that icon painting has hardly changed in 1,000 years. Figure 94, the Dormition Shroud icon at the National Shrine, painted in 2004 by Christine Uviges, shows that icon traditions haven't changed in more than 1,000 years. Courtesy of Icona Studios. Ironically, the Dormition Shroud, which represents a uniquely Orthodox point of view regarding the Virgin Mary's last day on earth, is owned by the National Shrine of the Roman Catholic Church, which maintains a very different view on Mary's final hours. The Metropolitan of the Ukrainian Catholic Church of America commissioned the shroud as a gift for the National Shrine of Roman Catholicism in Washington, D.C. The purpose of the gift and of representing an Orthodox tradition in the National Shrine of Catholicism was to help heal the schism between the Eastern and Western churches, which began in 1054. Islamic art, architectural pathways to God. In AD 610, a merchant named Muhammad took refuge in a cave near Mecca. According to Muhammad, during the night, the archangel Gabriel appeared and revealed to him truths that became the basis for a new religion, Islam. Throughout Muhammad's life, Gabriel enlightened him with revelations that Muhammad's followers recorded in the Muslim holy book, the Quran. Muhammad didn't reject the two other great monotheistic religions, Judaism and Christianity, but he said God commanded him to complete and perfect them. The Quran honors the Hebrew prophets, as well as Jesus. Muhammad, who was both a religious and political leader, converted and united the tribes of Arabia before his death in 632. Within 100 years of his death, Muhammad's successors, the caliphs, spread Islam by conquering Palestine, Syria, Egypt, and the rest of North Africa and seizing them from the Byzantine Empire. They also conquered Spain and penetrated into France. But Charles Martel turned back the Muslims at the Battle of Poitiers in 732. The new religion appealed to millions of people. Most of the conquered countries had been Christianized for centuries. But the majority of inhabitants switched to Islam. Those who didn't were usually permitted to practice their faith, without persecution. Like Moses, Muhammad banned graven images and anything that resembled idolatry. Therefore, Islamic countries produced very little figurative art and sculpture. But they excelled in architecture and in the decorative arts. At first, the caliphs made makeshift mosques, a fenced-in field, an ex-Christian church, a Persian hall, for the converts to Islam. But after the Muslims settled into their new lands, they began to build permanent, huge, elaborate mosques. Having no art traditions of their own, they borrowed from the people they conquered, and because they'd conquered so many different lands, the influx of influences was broad. Many early mosques had Byzantine and Persian elements, depending on their location. The huge Mosque of Mutawakkil in Samarra, Iraq, built between 848 and 852, which occupies almost 10 acres, resembles a Tower of Babel ziggurat. Obviously, the architect was inspired by ancient Mesopotamian structures. But the Muslims soon developed a uniquely Islamic style. In the following sections, I cover some of the finest examples of Islamic architecture. The Mosque of Córdoba. The Mosque of Córdoba was begun in AD 786. Córdoba, the capital of Islamic Spain, and Baghdad were the two greatest centers of Islamic culture in the 8th through 11th centuries. The caliphs expanded the Mosque of Córdoba in the middle and late 10th century. Inside, nearly 1,000 double-arched pillars support the mosque's massive roof. An upper tier of arches straddles the lower arches. Though the pillars are arranged in rows, they look like a vast stone forest fanning out in all directions. The complex vistas appear to interweave as you walk through the structure, making the mosque seem infinite. The architecture gives you the sense of journeying toward God. The maze of aisles all lead to the Qibla, which faces Mecca. The fact that so many aisles lead to the same place suggests that there are many pathways to prayer, many roads to the divine. Each worshipper must find his own path. This is quite different from Christian churches, where a single, center aisle leads to the altar, implying that there is only one path to God. Figure 95, the tunnels of arches in the Great Mosque of Córdoba pull visitors forward toward the Qibla, or praying area. Courtesy of Spanish National Tourist Office. Every mosque also has a mihrab that faces Mecca. The entrance to the mihrab is usually elaborately decorated because it's a symbolic gateway to the holy city. The mihrab of the Mosque of Córdoba, a domed chamber, is the architectural climax of the structure. The intricate carvings on the scalloped entrance arches look like a cross between script and ornament. This feature is typical, a reflection of the fact that Arabs were masters of calligraphy. The center of the mihrab dome is a stylized sculpted shell encrusted with a mosaic of blue, green, and reddish leaves and flowers on a golden background. The shell is encased in an 8-sided star, slashed by broad arcs that carry the dome's weight to the supports. Figure 96, the Magnify. Cent Mihrab dome of the Mosque of Córdoba was built in 965. Courtesy of Spanish National Tourist Office. The dazzling Alhambra. It's difficult to imagine anything more impressive than the Mosque of Córdoba, until you enter Granada's extraordinary palace and mosque, the Alhambra. The Alhambra was built between 1248 and 1354, when most of Spain had been retaken by the Christian forces of the Reconquista. Granada, the last Moorish holdout in Spain, capitulated to Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492. The most exquisite part of the Alhambra is the Macarnas dome in the Court of Lions, a rectangular courtyard with a pool surrounded by 12 white marble lions. The cap of the elaborate dome rests on a glowing, star-shaped base made of 16 windows. The 8-pointed, star-shaped cutout looks like it unfolded or blossomed to allow light to stream into the mosque. The dome cap and square ceiling that encases the star are lavishly embellished with stalactite-like ornaments that look like drippings from a melted candle. Figure 97, the elegant, filigree-walled pavilion of the Alhambra's Court of the Lions is a fitting setting for the spectacular art dome called the Macarnas. Courtesy of Spanish National Tourist Office. On closer inspection, these drippings reveal elaborate carvings of detailed geometric patterns. Where did this style come from? There's nothing like it in the countries the Arabs conquered. Perhaps because Islamic artists weren't allowed to represent the human figure, they packed all their creativity into linear designs. Many Arab scholars were devoted to the study of geometry and various types of arithmetic. Algebra derives from the Arabic algebra and trigonometry was devised by Islamic mathematicians. Maybe these mathematical preoccupations are rooted in this style of artwork. Whatever the reason, Islamic artists created some of the most complex and beautiful ornamentation in the history of art. Equally elaborate, calligraphic designs appear in Islamic manuscripts, like the cover of a 14th-century copy of the Quran from Cairo, Egypt, and a 13th-century Islamic textile from southern Spain called the Banner of Las Navas de Tolosa. The star within a star on the manuscript page is reminiscent of the star shapes in the mihrab of the Great Mosque of Córdoba and the dome in the Alhambra. The top and bottom border designs of the banner resemble Arabic script. Notice the 8-pointed star in the center of the banner. A temple of love, the Taj Mahal. When Shah Jahan's favorite wife, Mumtaz, died in childbirth, the number of white hairs in his beard more than tripled. At least that's what the court chronicler claimed. The remaining wives of the Muslim Mughal emperor of southern India couldn't console him. So Shah Jahan commissioned the most beautiful mausoleum in the world for her, a testament to his love. The result, the Taj Mahal in Agra, India, which took 23 years to complete. Today, the Taj Mahal, which seems to gaze at itself in the long pool that stretches from its entrance, is considered one of the wonders of the world. The building is a marriage of Islamic, Indian, Persian, and Mughal styles. None of the styles dominates, it's a harmonious marriage. In fact, the Taj Mahal is very musical architecture, using geometric theme and variation patterns. The 213-foot-high central onion dome is poised gracefully between two smaller domes. The dome motif is obviously the major theme of the architecture. Smaller variations of the domes cap the minarets that frame the building. The finial protruding from the main dome appears on all the other domes, as does the beanie cap decorated with a lotus petal design. These variations of the main visual theme contrast strikingly with the varied rectangular shapes and arches on the middle and lowest level. Architecture needs contrast just like music does. Loud and soft, fast and slow, and so on. The pointed archway of the grand entrance is echoed by smaller, but identically shaped, windows on the building's flanks. The arch is the second visual motif. The lateral domes and minaret domes sit on arched arcades, which continue the arch theme, while adding variation. Instead of being hoop-shaped, the arcade arches are pedaled in typical Islamic fashion. The intricate design work in the door frame is repeated in the window frames. To appreciate the magnificence of this building, try to actually think of it as visual music. Imagine the domes are a great booming musical motif, a powerful melody line that sets off a train of echoes, the minaret domes. The rectangles and arched openings below the domes are the varied baseline that supports the melody. Arabesques carved into the rectangles are analogous to the trills and other musical ornaments in a Baroque cantata. They delight the eye with exotic surprises amidst the swelling shapes of the domes and grand, inviting doorways and windows. It's hard to believe that such a magnificent building is merely a mausoleum. In any case, it's one of the most visited sites in India. Chapter 10. Mystics, Marauders, and Manuscripts, Medieval Art. In this chapter, Tracing the squigglies in illuminated manuscripts, reading a tapestry that isn't a tapestry, tracking medieval developments in architecture, peering into the medieval world of painting and sculpture. Reading a tapestry that is a tapestry. When Rome fell, Western civilization's lights went out. Sort of. The Western Empire's collapse unleashed political chaos and caused a cultural blackout throughout Western Europe. The barbarian tribes that broke the back of the empire, including the Vandals, Visigoths, Franks, and Lombards, now fought each other, grabbing land on one